Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. We are going to talk about the history of Thanksgiving, where it comes from, why we celebrate it, and what it means to our indigenous brothers and sisters. But first, this is Latina Literati. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Feasting as a way of giving thanks is not new, both on the indigenous or Native American traditions as well as the European traditions. Both had a Thanksgiving feast or feasts to give thanks for victories at war, for different celebrations, for marriages, for unions, for different treaties. And so this is not a new concept. For many, many millennia, humankind has wanted to feast in celebration and in gratitude. But the holiday that is celebrated by most people in North America is something that arises out of the first encounter, the first time that the indigenous people save the settler colonialists that arrive. And this, of course, happens in 1620. So you have on Plymouth, the famous Plymouth Rock, you have a group that arrive, and half of them will not survive those first months on ship because of scurvy, because of disease, because of lack of basic food and clean water. When they finally do descend from the ship, they see a very plentiful place. They see land that is cleared because, of course, the indigenous people had cleared it. They see plenty of animals that can be hunted, and they think it is divine providence. They say, of course, God wants us to settle here. Also, pretty lucky that one of the first indigenous people, Native Americans, that they meet is a man by the name of Squanto. And that's just a nickname. His real name was Nisquatam. But Squanto had been enslaved, and he'd escaped and made his way back to find literally just a pile of bones of his group or tribe, of his relatives, because trackers and hunters before him had spread disease. So it is now thought that between 90 to 98% of all Native American people throughout the hemisphere succumb to the terrible diseases that are brought by the settler colonialists. Whether they knew about it or not, genocide, complete annihilation of a people. So Squanto had not only survived the disease, but he had learned English. And so he was the reason that the first settler colonialists are able to speak to the indigenous tribes in the area. And there were two tribes that were in competition, but the settler colonialists make an agreement, a pact with the Wanapanaog, and they are able to settle and live in relative tranquility in an area close to what is called Plymouth. Well, they called it Plymouth Plantation, but so the important thing here is that Squanto not only is able to save their lives from the indigenous people who want to obviously attack them because they're invaders, they have no papers, no right to settle, no right to be here, and yet the indigenous people not only allow them to be here, welcome them, but teach them to survive that first winter. They are taught to plant the three sisters. So squash, beans, and corn. The indigenous people call them the three sisters because the nutrients help each other grow. They were taught to put fish as fertilizer into the crops. They were taught how to hunt. They were taught how to catch the different animals around them. And so it is only because of Squanto and the other indigenous people that the few settler colonialists that actually do survive are able to thrive and live through that first winter. And so it is in the fall, when the harvest has come in, that they want to celebrate. And so in again, settler colonial mentality, they start to shoot bullets in the air. And so when the Wanapana warriors hear this, they think it's a threat. And so they say, some accounts say 70, other accounts say 90 warriors show up, would have massacred them had, again, Squanto not been there to interpret and let them know these crazy guys are just shooting in the air. They don't actually mean anything. And then when the warriors saw what they were eating, they said, you actually need more food. So they went out and hunted deer and brought it back and feasted for 3 days with them. So the concept that it was a polite invitation between two groups is simply not true. The settler colonialists were absolutely dependent on the knowledge from the Native Americans. The Native Americans could not know that this was the beginning of the end. That not only had all of the disease undone them, but that the settler colonialists would never be satisfied with the land that had been allowed their use. Really interesting, many people don't know that 5 million Native Americans were enslaved by the settler colonialists, some even sent to the Caribbean to work on plantations later. So we're talking about over 400 years of abuse, of broken promises, of genocide, of slavery. So to think that Native Americans are going to want to celebrate this holiday is folly. So during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln has just ordered the massacre of Indians in the Dakotas who were being starved because corrupt military personnel were selling the food they were supposed to give to the group in the Dakotas. And so over 80 warriors were hung. It was one of the biggest massacres. And they were hung because they stood up and they said, we're not going to allow you to starve our people. And they wanted the food that had been promised to them under the treaties. You'll recall that since Plymouth Rock, every single treaty entered into by the United States with any indigenous group has been broken. And that's really important. So Abraham Lincoln is counseled that to try and unify the country, we're in the Civil War, let's have a Thanksgiving holiday, a holiday where people come together. It's not religious. People come together to give thanks. And so that was when it was begun. So it's only about 150 years. It's not that old a tradition, but it is a tradition that is the most honored in the United States. More people will travel during this Thanksgiving week than any other week in the year. Some by car, rail, plane, and so if you can, avoid all of those because this particular week is absolutely jam-packed full of people traveling to their family or friends. So Friends Thanksgiving, of course, has also become very popular. For the indigenous people, it is called the Day of Mourning because it is a remembrance of the genocide, of the mistreatment, of the broken promises, of all the terrible things that have occurred to the indigenous people, to the native people for the last 400 years. And so if you haven't been, I will leave a link in the description box where you can listen to the indigenous gathering for sunrise ceremony on what the Native Americans call Turtle Island, what the Spanish called Alcatraz. I've been several times and it's incredibly powerful because as the boat lands, as you walk to the plateau where the ceremony is taking place, it's pitch black and you can hear the drums. And the drums, the resonance of the drums just fill you with a wonderful feeling, a welcoming feeling. And as you gather, hundreds of people are there. Indigenous groups from all over the world gather. And there is always the Palestinian flag to recognize them as the indigenous people of Palestine. There are indigenous groups from South America, from New Zealand, Australia, from all of the different groups, and it's very powerful. No pictures or cameras are allowed, so you can hear the transmission from 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and I'll leave that link in the description box. So if on Thursday, Thanksgiving morning, you'd like to hear what the indigenous sunrise ceremony, in gratitude but also in recognition of all that has been lost, I invite you because it is very powerful and it gives a balance to the fairy tale that we are taught in school. And it is absolute fairy tale what we are taught, that it was just a handshake and an invite and everybody got together. The actual feast probably had things like seal and oysters and deer, and there were lots of turkeys, but definitely not as many sweets as there are in usual Thanksgiving tables. This is a time that we should remember those who are no longer with us, and also to give thanks. In fact, one indigenous scholar said that the indigenous way of life, or the native way of life, is that every day we are in Thanksgiving. Every day we should arise to give thanks. And so as you gather with your friends and family, give thanks, of course, and always blessings to all of you. And now for my favorite part of the video, the book recommendations. There are plenty of books that you can read on Thanksgiving and what happened, but there are some books that I feel give a more balanced approach. And so the first book that I would like to recommend to you is William Bradford's Plymouth's Faithful Pilgrims. And so this, again, gives a more balanced view of what is happening, first-hand account of what occurred, which I think is far more valid than just as I mentioned, the fairy tale that we're told at school. The second book I want to recommend to you is by Anne Byers, and she does a great job of focusing on a central character that normally people don't know that much about, Squanto. And what an amazing life he had, ripped from his family, enslaved, escaped, gets on a ship, comes back to find only the bones of his relatives, and is still willing to help the settler colonialists be their interpreter, have them understand how things work, and save their lives by teaching them specific agricultural and hunting practices for the area. I mean, it's pretty amazing. I mean, yes, I think he did it obviously for his own survival, because that gave him a special treatment from the indigenous people and, of course, from the settler colonialists. So I think Squanto is a fascinating character, and it's well worth understanding a little bit more about who he was and his life adventures. The third book I'm going to recommend to you is one by Paula Gunn Allen. She does a fabulous job with new historical sources at looking at someone who was a survivor, a diplomat. She really did an amazing job also of trying to bring about some sort of peace between the settler colonialists and her people. Of course, I'm talking about Pocahontas. And so it's not the Disney film, but it is definitely a woman that we have misunderstood, who unfortunately is taken by her husband to England and passes away there because of course, lack of hygiene and the cold and the diseases that are there. But this is a woman who is worth studying, worth looking at, and not unlike Malinche in Mexico, really makes a difference in the history of the settler colonialists, their ability to survive. So as always, thank you so much for this joint journey. We'd love to hear from you. What are you thinking about on this Thanksgiving? What are you grateful for? What are the books that you're reading? We want to hear from you, so let us know in the comments. Thank you so much. As always, con mucho cariño, mucho salud, mucho amor. Gracias.